Hello friends, welcome back to Cosmopolitan Cornbread. So I thought I would bring you out here this evening, sitting out here in the garden. Obviously, it was a busy day of errand running and all of that stuff. I usually go into Fort Smith about once a week to do my shopping and check my P.O. box and things like that. And when I was looking at my comments on social media, I can't remember if it was on Instagram or if it was a YouTube video or what it was. It might have been on YouTube. Someone mentioned being very interested in the story of how Mr. Smith and I met. And so I thought, you know what? I think I will film that for my Friday video because I've mentioned wanting to do that and I hadn't done it. And because I spent most of the day today running errands and all of that because I live a ways from Fort Smith. I didn't really have anything else planned, so I thought today was the perfect day to do that. And so I thought I would share the story of how Mr. Smith and I met. For those of you who are brand new here, welcome. My name is Constance. I've been a blogger for going on 2 decades and launched this YouTube channel several years ago. And Mr. Smith, my husband, and I have been married for 33 years. We lived all over the place. We were a military family. He was active duty Army for 25 years. We lived in Virginia, Texas, Germany, North Carolina, Alaska, Alabama, and we had planted roots in Alabama. Thought we were going to live there forever until the Lord called us here to Arkansas, and now we live in the mountains. Here in Arkansas, we moved here last year, where we have been building a new homestead. And I shared the story of how that all came about in a video, which I'll put in a link in the video description if you're interested. But often people will ask how Mr. Smith and I met, because I grew up in Wisconsin. My husband grew up as an Army brat. Like our children, lived all over the place. His family was from East Tennessee, but my family was from Wisconsin. Well, back in 1990, going way back, Mr. Smith and I both graduated high school, different states. So my original plan all through high school was to go to college. I was accepted to the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, and I was going to be a biologist. And life just kind of went a different route. And instead of going to college immediately after high school, I ended up working 2 different jobs. I worked full-time in a restaurant, and I also worked part-time in a grocery store for a while. And ultimately decided I didn't want that to be my life, and I decided it was time for me to move on from my parents' home. And I thought the quickest way for that to happen was for me to join the military. And so I decided I was going to join the Army. And so I enlisted in the Army. I enlisted as communications. My first day in basic training was January 15th, 1991, which was the day that the United States had given Saddam Hussein a deadline of getting out of Kuwait or else. And so that was my first day in basic training. And coincidentally, it was also Mr. Smith's first day in basic training. Now, when we went through basic training, it wasn't co-ed basic training like it is nowadays. There were male soldiers in one unit and there were female soldiers in another unit. And while our training was parallel, we weren't combined. We didn't do anything together except one thing. And even then, it wasn't really together, but it was chapel service. So here it was, Fort Dix, New Jersey, basic training. And back then, pretty much everyone went to chapel service because it was the only time of the week that you had a break from the drill sergeants. And you know, when we went through basic training, was a lot different than it is nowadays. But whether you were a devout believer or not, you went to chapel just to get away from the drill sergeants and have that break and not be pulled into doing a detail or something like that, and having to scrub the barracks and polish the floors and all of that stuff. And so here it was, the very first chapel service of basic training, and we were there a little bit early, and there was a row of male soldiers in front of me, and I was in a row of female soldiers, and we were just kind of sitting there waiting for the service to start. And like any good soldier in training, I had a notepad in my pocket because we were always supposed to be ready to take notes of any words of wisdom from our drill sergeants back then. And so I pulled out this notepad from my pocket and I wrote on the piece of paper, I said, "Hey guys, how do you like basic so far?" And I folded it up and I threw it over the shoulder in front of me. And lo and behold, that soldier wrote on the piece of paper and tossed it back over his shoulder. And that was Mr. Smith. So here it was, like I said, the very first chapel service of basic training. And we just wrote letters to one another. And every time we went to chapel service, we would have a letter for each other. As the male soldiers were leaving the chow hall, the female soldiers would be coming in, and the line kind of went around the dining hall. And there was this little partition wall. And Mr. Smith would always make sure he got a seat right up against that wall so that he could drop a letter on the floor and kick it under the wall. And I would do the same. And sometimes it was the male soldiers eating first, sometimes it was the females. And we always made sure that we got that seat along the wall so we could drop a letter. And this went on all through basic training. Now, I began basic training, the in-processing stuff, on January 15th, like I mentioned. Mr. Smith and I met the beginning of actual basic training, which would have been February 2nd. The first chapel service of actual basic training, because you know, you get the in-processing where you do all the paperwork and you get your uniforms and you get all your equipment issued to you and all that stuff before actual basic training starts. So that all started on January 15th. The very first chapel service of actual basic training was February 2nd. And on March 10th, just a few weeks later, just a few weeks of continual letter writing and passing letters and praying we wouldn't get caught by the drill sergeants, just like it was middle school and not wanting to get caught by the teacher. March 10th, he wrote me a letter and asked me to marry him. We'd never been on a date. We had never had any alone time together. It was nothing but letter writing and occasional sneaking of a phone call from one payphone to another during personal time in the evenings. And that's all it was. And I remember writing my mom a letter saying, because I had told her about this young soldier that I had met and how nice he was and all this stuff. And I told her about him. And in the next letter, I said, by the way, we're engaged. Now the whole family was in shock, and I am sure that they all thought we were nuts and that it would never last. But a couple weeks later, basic training had ended, and we had our graduation. My future in-laws came to the graduation, and I was able to meet them. And then Mr. Smith and I went in two different directions. He went to Fort Eustis, Virginia for his AIT, his training for his job. And I went to Fort Gordon, Georgia, where I did my training for my Army job. And, you know, that was the end of March. And a few weeks later, we decided that we needed to go ahead and get married. That way we could file the paperwork so that we could get stationed together. Because unless you do the paperwork to get stationed in the same place, you know, I might have gone to Korea and he might have gone someplace else. We may not have actually been together. And so we decided to go ahead and get married. And so just a few weeks later, we met on a weekend pass. My parents and my grandparents drove all the way down to Georgia. At the time, Mr. Smith's parents lived in Georgia. They lived there for a little while, and so we all converged on Dallas, Georgia. And we went to the courthouse there, and it was Judge Fran Watson who did our short little ceremony, quick and simple. I had gone and bought an off-the-rack wedding dress, and Mr. Smith wore, I think, a suit that belonged to his dad. And we just met. We had the ceremony in Judge Fran Watson's office, and that was that. We were married, and afterwards we had like a big dinner at a restaurant, and then the next day we went back to AIT because it was only the weekend that we had together, and then that began our married life. And I will never forget, after my family all went back up to Wisconsin, I got letters from my grandparents, and my one grandmother was a quilter. She did all sorts of quilts, and as a wedding gift she made Mr. Smith and I a beautiful quilt. We slept under that quilt for 13 years straight until that quilt became so threadbare I didn't dare use it any longer, and it is folded up and stored away in a trunk because it is precious to me. Well, that very first letter that I got from my grandmother, she said, "Oh, by the way, I made a matching baby quilt." No pressure. And then my other grandmother, my dad's mom, wrote me a letter also, and I still have both of these letters somewhere stored away in a photo album. But I'll never forget what she said. You know, my grandma Ingalls, my mom's mom, she traveled a lot. Her and my grandfather traveled quite a bit, and they saw a lot of things. But my dad's mom, my grandma Doll, she didn't travel much. She never really traveled outside that part of the country. And that very first letter that I got from her, she talked about how she saw the mountains for the very first time. And then after the wedding, they kind of took the roundabout way back up to Wisconsin. And she talked about how she got to see the ocean for the very first time. And after that, you know, they never really traveled again. So it was the one and only time she ever saw the mountains and she ever saw the ocean. And she thanked me for that. And, you know, they all thought the wedding was so sweet and simple. And I'm sure, like I said, they all thought we were crazy and that it wouldn't last. But it's been 33 years. We have 3 grown children. We have 2 grandbabies. We've lived all over the place. And that's our story. And believe it or not, somewhere in a box, packed away, are all of those letters that Mr. Smith and I wrote to each other all through basic training. I kept every one of them. And it's so funny going back and reading them with much older eyes and just thinking about how something so simple and so seemingly silly would be so life-changing. And as I said, Mr. Smith made a career of Army life. I ended up not staying in, but it all worked out exactly as it was supposed to. So that is the story of how Mr. Smith and I met, and I hope you enjoyed having a little bit of story time. It's so funny how it seems like a lifetime ago, but at the same time, it seems like it just happened. So that is it for today, friends. Thanks for spending some time with me out here in the garden and having a little bit of a story time. My name is Constance from Cosmopolitan Cornbread, and I'll talk to y'all next time.